I worked at a small independent movie theater in a quiet part of the city. We weren't part of any chain, just a three-screen place with velvet seats, aging projectors, and a snack counter that still used a manual cash register. On weekdays, especially during the late-night showings, business slowed down to a crawl. Most people only came in on weekends or for special screenings, which meant that several nights a week, I was completely alone in the building from around 10 p.m. until I locked up at midnight. I had a routine. After the last show started, I'd wait until about 15 minutes in to check the doors, make sure no one had snuck in, and then close up the ticket booth and snack bar. Once the final films ended, usually around 11:45, I'd sweep up the trash in the theaters, shut down the projectors, turn off the marquee lights, and set the alarm before heading out through the side employee door. I didn't mind being alone, at least not at first. The first time I noticed something was off was one Thursday night in October. I remember the date because we were doing a retro horror film week showing classics like Halloween and The Exorcist, and attendance had been higher than usual. That night, after locking the front doors, I was heading into Theater 2 to sweep up when I heard someone coughing inside. It startled me. I'd thought the last guest had left already, but I figured maybe they stuck around during the credits, so I pushed open the door and stepped in. The room was dim, lit only by the soft amber glow of the exit sign above the back door. The screen had gone dark already. I stood near the front, eyes scanning the seats. "Hello?" I called out. Silence. I walked up the aisle slowly, the broomstick tapping softly against my leg. Row by row I looked, but no one was there. I even checked behind the curtains near the emergency exit in case someone was playing a prank or trying to sneak out late. Nothing. I told myself it had been the building shifting, maybe air in the ducts mimicking a sound, but something about it stuck with me. Over the next week, it got worse. A few nights later, I was closing up again when I noticed one of the projector reels in Theater 1 was spinning in reverse. I hadn't touched it since starting the film, and I knew for a fact no one else was in the building. I paused the machine, checked the settings, and rewound it properly. But for the rest of the shift, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been in there just minutes before me. Then I started hearing footsteps. Not loud, just a slow, shuffling sound, always in the lobby when I was in the projection booth, always stopping the moment I reached the stairs. At first, I assumed it was echo or creaking boards, until I began hearing them on the carpet too. One night, I was turning off the soda machine when I heard a whisper behind me. It was right in my ear, so close I flinched and spun around. There was no one there. The whisper wasn't in any language I knew. It was more like a series of breathy syllables, soft but distinct. I tried to recreate the sound in my head later and couldn't. I didn't mention any of it to my manager. He was only there during the daytime, and I already knew he'd write it off as nerves or exhaustion. So I kept quiet and started carrying a small flashlight with me. Not for light, our lights worked fine, but for the sound. The clicking of it turning on and off became a small comfort, a reminder I was still in control of something. Then came the night I decided to leave early. It was a Wednesday. The last movie had 3 people in attendance, all seated apart from each other. I cleaned Theater 3 as they left, shut down the projectors a little early, and decided to close up 10 minutes before midnight. I'd locked the front doors and was heading toward the side exit when I noticed something on the floor. It was a pile of old movie tickets. They were laid out in a neat spiral like a snail's shell, right in front of the snack counter. They were faded and yellowed, tickets we hadn't used in years. Our current stubs were thermal printed, but these had the old red ink and the theater's former logo, which had been discontinued before I even started working there. I bent down to gather them, trying to rationalize it. Maybe they were stuck behind the counter and someone knocked them out. Maybe the cleaners missed them. But when I picked up the first few, I noticed that they all had today's date stamped on them, my shift date, the same time, 11:55 p.m. on every single one. I dropped them. I looked around quickly, heart racing. The lobby was empty. I stood completely still, listening. I could hear the soft hum of the exit sign, the faint buzz of the overhead lights, but nothing else. Then the projector in Theater 2 turned on. I heard the whir of the motor, the sudden flicker of light behind the glass window up in the booth, but I hadn't scheduled anything after 10:30. There was no film loaded. I hesitated, then slowly walked toward the theater. The doors were slightly ajar. As I stepped inside, I saw the screen was glowing white, static playing across it, though our projectors didn't show static when idle. It looked like an old analog feed, flickering like a broken television. There was a figure sitting in the front row, not watching the screen, just sitting. I froze. My first instinct was to shout, to demand who it was, but I couldn't. My voice caught in my throat. I stepped closer, squinting into the dim light. The figure looked like a man, thin, slouched forward, but his head was tilted at an unnatural angle like it had been broken. He sat motionless. I stepped back. My shoes squeaked on the floor, and I winced at the sound. The figure twitched, just once. Enough to let me know it was aware of me. I bolted, I ran out the side exit, didn't set the alarm, didn't turn off the lights. I just got in my car and drove home, heart slamming against my chest. The next day, I called in sick. When I returned 2 days later, I acted like nothing happened. I didn't ask if anyone had found anything strange, didn't ask about the projector. But from then on, I refused to go into Theater 2 alone. One of the other employees, Lisa, started asking me weird questions. She worked daytime shifts mostly, but occasionally covered weekends. She asked me if I ever heard things during cleanup. I played dumb. Then she said, I saw someone walk out of Theater 1 last Saturday night, but there were only 2 people watching the movie, a man and his daughter. I watched them leave. Then, 5 minutes later, someone else came out. Walked straight down the aisle and into the bathroom. Maybe they were hiding, I offered. She shook her head. I checked the bathroom. It was empty, and the lobby door was locked. I didn't answer, but I knew. Things kept happening. I began hearing the sound of film spooling when there was nothing running. I'd walk past the projection room and hear voices, sometimes laughing, sometimes whispering. The lights in Theater 2 flickered constantly. I stopped using it altogether. We just told customers it was being renovated. The worst night came in early December. It had been snowing, and the last showing was canceled because of the weather. I was asked to stay and inventory the snack bar. I didn't want to, but I needed the hours. I turned on the overhead lights, kept the front doors locked, and started checking the candy stock. About an hour in, I heard something hit the floor in the lobby. Not a tap or knock, something falling. I walked out to look. There was a soda cup on the floor. I hadn't stocked soda that night. It was one of the old design cups we'd stopped using months ago. Then I heard something behind me. I turned, but there was nothing, until I looked at the glass doors. There was a handprint, pressed against the inside. Not outside, inside. Fingers long and thin, almost inhuman. I ran. I went straight out the back. This time I didn't come back. I quit the next day, sent a text, and never picked up my last check. Months passed. Eventually, I drove by the theater one night out of curiosity. It was closed, lights off, marquee blank. I pulled into the lot and sat for a while just staring. Then the lights in Theater 2 came on. Just for a moment. And I swear I saw a figure in the window of the projection booth watching me. I drove away. I've had nightmares ever since. About that theater. About the man with the broken neck sitting in the front row, about the tickets with my name on them, about voices whispering things I can't understand. People say buildings can't be haunted, but I think something lived in that place, something that didn't want to be seen, something that watched people in the dark night after night until it learned to imitate them. And I think it got good at it. Too good. Story the end. I used to work the night shift at a 24-hour self-storage facility in Western Illinois, the kind of job most people don't know exists. It was an odd position. Not retail, not quite security. My title was night attendant, which essentially meant I was alone in the office from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., managing phone calls, doing paperwork, and walking patrols through the long corridors of storage units spaced out across the complex. There were 4 buildings total, A through D, and they were each about 2 stories high, with indoor and climate-controlled units. Most of the night was quiet, sometimes too quiet. You start to notice how the fluorescent lights buzz a little louder when there's no one around, how the motion-activated hallway lights click on just a little slower than you expect. Most nights, I was completely alone. Customers rarely came in after 10, and if they did, they used their unique gate codes and usually didn't bother me. That was part of the job I liked. No coworkers, minimal interaction, just long stretches of solitude. It started with Building C. That building always felt different. Even during the day, the temperature seemed colder, the air thicker. I chalked it up to the insulation or maybe poor ventilation, but I always made a point to finish my rounds there quickly. One night, around 2:30 a.m., I was doing my usual patrol with a flashlight, walking through the narrow, dim corridors of Building C when I heard something strange. The sound was faint, like metal dragging against concrete, but constant. I stopped walking and listened. It was coming from around the corner, maybe 15 or 20 feet away. I thought maybe a tenant had come in late and was moving something heavy. I announced myself like we were supposed to. Storage staff here. Just doing rounds. No response. I turned the corner and found the hallway completely empty. No units open, no carts, no people. But the sound stopped. I stood there for a moment, feeling that thick air around me, then started walking back toward the entrance. A few steps later, I heard the noise again, but this time, it was behind me. I spun around. Still nothing. The light flickered above me. When I got back to the office, I checked the log on the gate access system. No one had come in since 11:08 p.m., and Building C's motion sensors hadn't been tripped at all. That was the first night I felt genuinely unsettled. A few days later, the phone rang around 4 a.m., an unusual time for a call, but not impossible. I answered with the standard script. The line was silent. I repeated myself. Still nothing. Just soft static. I was about to hang up when I heard it. Breathing. Shallow, deliberate breathing, like someone holding the phone just beneath their nose. I waited. The breathing continued for several seconds. Then, a click. No caller ID. Just unknown number. I told myself it was a prank, maybe some drunk college kid with nothing better to do. But something about the way the breathing was so steady stuck with me. The next incident was a storage unit, C214. I noticed it on my rounds a week after the phone call. The unit's door was slightly ajar, not enough to raise alarm, just maybe half an inch. Enough to see darkness inside. I made a note to report it in the log, but figured I'd check it out myself before calling the manager. Storage units are supposed to lock automatically unless someone manually lifts the latch. When I approached, I saw the latch was closed, but the padlock was missing. I knocked lightly on the door, just in case someone was inside. It happens sometimes. People sleep in their units, even though it's against policy. No answer. I opened the door slowly. The unit was empty, totally bare. No boxes, no shelves, no stray trash, just an unpainted concrete floor and walls. I stepped inside and immediately regretted it. The temperature dropped drastically. It was like stepping into a freezer. My breath fogged. There was a damp, metallic smell, like blood and rust, and something else I couldn't place. I backed out and closed the door, locking it with a temporary facility lock we kept in the utility closet. That night, I didn't finish my rounds. I stayed in the office, lights on, the radio playing quietly. When I told the day manager about it the next morning, he looked up C2114 in the system. According to the logs, it hadn't been rented in over 6 months. He seemed annoyed, like I was wasting his time. I asked about the missing lock. He shrugged it off. Maybe a past customer never returned it. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been in there. Not someone. Something. About 2 weeks later, something changed in the air around the facility. I was used to being alone, used to the silence. But now, the silence had weight. Pressure. I started hearing strange sounds on the security monitors. We didn't have cameras inside the units themselves, but we had them in all the hallways and outside the buildings. Late at night, when I should have seen nothing but empty corridors, the motion alerts started going off. At first, I saw small things. A shadow passing by the edge of the frame, a light flickering to life in a hallway that should have been dark. Then, a figure, tall, thin, blurry, always just outside the center of the frame, never facing the camera, never moving normally. It was like watching an old VHS tape that had been re-recorded too many times, jerky and off rhythm. I'd rewind, pause, zoom in. But there was never a clear image, just the suggestion of someone or something there. One night, the motion alert triggered for Building C. I pulled up the camera feed. The hallway was empty, except the light at the end kept flickering. Then, something walked past. Not toward the camera, not away. Just across the corridor, side to side like it was pacing. But there's no cross hallway there, nothing to pace between. I grabbed my flashlight and went to check it out. Part of me needed to prove it was nothing, that I wasn't losing my mind. The hallway was dead silent when I stepped inside. No flickering, no movement. I walked slowly, calling out again. No answer. I reached the end of the corridor where the figure had crossed. There was nothing there. But as I turned around, every light in the hall shut off at once. I froze. Then I heard it again, breathing. But this time, right behind me. I didn't look. I ran. Out of Building C, across the lot, back into the office. I locked the door behind me, panting and shaking. I didn't finish the shift. I waited until dawn with every light on and the security monitors off. The manager asked if I'd been using again. I wasn't. Hadn't touched anything in over a year. I didn't argue with him. I needed the job. But after that night, I refused to enter Building C after midnight. I'd fake patrol reports, just write down that all was clear. I couldn't bring myself to walk those halls again. The final straw came a month later. I'd gotten a little too used to the unease, had started ignoring the strange sounds, even the static on the phone. But one night, around 3:12 a.m., the power went out. Everything. Office lights, hallway lights, even the security backup battery. Gone. I stepped outside with my flashlight. The buildings looked darker than usual. Not just unlit, wrong, like they were absorbing what little moonlight there was. Then I heard the storage unit alarms go off, 4 of them in succession. C211, C212, C213, and C214. The padlock I'd put on C214 should have prevented any alarm. I ran to the building and stopped outside. The door was slightly open. It wasn't supposed to be, and it locked automatically. I heard the units rattling inside, metal clanging against metal, like someone kicking at the doors from the inside. I stood frozen, flashlight pointed toward the hallway. The door creaked wider on its own. I swear I never touched it. I could hear something moving down the corridor, not footsteps, something dragging. I turned and ran. I didn't look back. I quit the next morning. Left the keys on the manager's desk and never returned his calls. A few months later, I checked online out of curiosity. The facility was listed as under renovation. Then, a year later, it quietly shut down. The buildings are still there, but no new company has bought it. It just sits vacant. Sometimes I drive by. I don't stop. I don't look too long. But once at night, I thought I saw a light flickering inside Building C. And every once in a while, around 3 a.m., my phone rings. Unknown number. Breathing. Story the end. The building where I worked wasn't anything special, just a bland 3-story concrete block tucked into the back corner of an industrial park on the edge of town. It used to be a packaging company, I think, but by the time I started working there, it had been partially renovated into a call center. No windows on the ground floor, yellowing fluorescent lights, worn-down carpet that always smelled faintly of old coffee and damp cardboard. Not a place people cared about, including the ones who worked there. I was part of the overnight support team. 3 people scheduled, but usually only 2 showed up. Some nights, I was the only one. It was easy work. Answer a few tech support calls, mostly for clients in other time zones, and otherwise do data entry or system checks on autopilot. They let us wear headphones, bring snacks, whatever we needed to stay awake. No dress code, no supervisor after 8 p.m. But that also meant if something went wrong, you were on your own. It was around mid-November when things started to feel off. I'd been there about a year by then. The other overnight guy, Lucas, had quit without notice, just didn't show up one night, and no one could reach him afterward. That left me pulling solo shifts until they hired someone new. The first night I was completely alone. I brought extra coffee, downloaded a few podcasts, and figured I'd coast through the hours like usual. At around 1:30 a.m., I took a short walk down the hallway to stretch my legs. The call center floor was open, with cubicles arranged in rows and a glass-walled manager's office in the back. Beyond that were 2 narrow hallways. One led to the break room and storage, the other toward the bathrooms and the rear stairwell. I took the break room route. Everything was quiet, like always. The hum of computers and low air vents created a kind of dull static that usually lulled me into a focused rhythm. But that night, I had this strange sense that I wasn't alone. You know how sometimes when you're walking somewhere late at night, your body just knows something's off before your brain does? That's how it felt. My skin prickled, my chest tightened. I told myself I was just jumpy being by myself. Still, I peeked into the break room. Empty. Walked back, slower than usual. When I sat back down at my desk, I noticed something odd. One of the computer monitors across the room was on. We had a power-saving feature that turned everything off after 10 minutes of inactivity. It had been well over 10 minutes since anyone touched that workstation. I hadn't even gone near that side of the floor. I stared at the screen, squinting to see if maybe it was just rebooting or updating, but the login page was active. The cursor blinked in the middle of the password box like someone had just typed something and backspaced it. I stood up, walked over, no one behind the cubicle, no chair pulled out, but the mouse was warm. That stopped me. I put the palm of my hand on it again just to check. Warm, not hot like it had been in use just a moment ago. That was impossible. I checked the building's security logs later from my workstation. Each employee had a key card, and every door had a badge reader. According to the system, no one had entered or exited the building since my check-in at 7:54 p.m. No one else was inside. Just me. I logged the incident in the internal report system as a hardware error and tried to move on. But the weird stuff didn't stop. 3 nights later, the rear stairwell alarm went off at 3:12 a.m. The door back there was supposed to stay locked from the inside and outside after hours unless someone with supervisor-level clearance opened it. I practically jumped out of my chair when the alert popped up on my monitor. I pulled up the hallway camera feed for the stairwell. At first, the hallway was empty. Then, about 15 seconds before the alarm went off, the feed cut, just glitched out for about 3 seconds. When it came back, the door was ajar. I grabbed the small flashlight we kept in the drawer and walked cautiously toward the back hallway. My heart was pounding so loud I could barely hear my own footsteps. When I reached the stairwell door, it was shut again. Locked. I pushed on it, solid. Nothing in the hallway, no sound, no movement. I checked the stairwell anyway. 3 floors, dim emergency lights, no signs of anyone. I backed away and returned to my desk, locked the screen, and sat down, staring at the badge log again. No entry recorded for the door. I tried calling the site manager. No answer. I texted him and got a reply hours later. Weird. Probably a glitch in the alarm system. Don't worry about it. The next few shifts were quiet, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Not constantly, but every now and then I'd feel it. Like someone standing just at the edge of my vision, just out of reach. I started bringing a second desk lamp to brighten the corners of my cubicle. I even brought a mirror from home and leaned it against my monitor just to see behind me. I didn't feel safe turning my back to the room anymore. Then came the night I nearly quit. It was snowing, cold, and silent outside. I was halfway through my shift when I started hearing a soft knocking. Not from the entrance or the windows, but inside the building. A rhythmic, deliberate tap, tap, tap. I muted my music and listened. It was coming from the back hallway again. I stood up, flashlight in hand, and walked back toward the bathrooms. The sound was louder now, definitely knocking, slow and steady, coming from behind the janitor's closet door. That door was always locked. We didn't even have the key. I put my ear close to the door. The knocking stopped. Then I heard breathing. I swear to God, I heard someone breathing right on the other side. I turned and walked fast, nearly ran back to the open floor, and as I passed the hallway camera monitor, I saw something that made my knees go weak. There was a figure standing just outside the closet door. In the camera feed, not in real life. A pale shape, indistinct, like someone wearing all white, head tilted slightly. No facial features, just standing there. Still. Unmoving. I flipped through other feeds, nothing in the stairwell, nothing near the entrance, nothing on the floor. Back to the closet cam. Gone. I logged off my station and waited out the rest of the shift near the security console in the front lobby, with every light on. That was the last night I worked alone. I begged the manager for day shifts or reassignment. When I finally told him everything, he stared at me for a long time and then said, "You're not the first." He told me, in a low voice, like he wasn't sure he should say anything, that the janitor who used to work overnight had also quit suddenly. Left his keys and badge on the desk, never came back. Before him, an IT guy named Roland stopped showing up after people in the walls. Nobody had taken him seriously. No one had ever seen anyone break in. No one had ever caught anything on full camera. But people felt things, heard things. A month later, I found out through another coworker that the building had originally been part of a failed mental health facility back in the 70s, only partially demolished before being converted into offices. Apparently, the third floor wasn't renovated at all, just sealed off. I'd never been up there. I didn't want to. To this day, I don't know what I saw in the hallway or why the mouse was warm or who or what was breathing behind the closet door. But I know I wasn't alone. Not really. Something else is in that building. Watching, waiting, following. I changed jobs the next month. I still can't use mirrors at work. And I never stay late. Story the end. I remember that night so clearly, even though I've tried hard to bury it deep in my mind. It was a cold, rainy Thursday evening in November, and I was working late at the hospital where I was employed as a radiology technician. The shift had started routinely enough. A few scans, some paperwork, the usual patient calls. But by 7 p.m., the hospital was nearly empty. Most departments had wrapped up for the night or had skeleton crews. My job involved working the imaging department alone from 7 p.m. to midnight twice a week, which was fine, mostly quiet, sometimes even peaceful. But this particular night was different from the moment I arrived. The rain was relentless, tapping a steady rhythm against the windows. I remember parking far away from the entrance, partly because I wanted to be the last to leave the parking lot so no one would disturb me. It was the kind of night where the fluorescent lights inside the hospital seemed too harsh compared to the soft rain outside. The imaging department was on the third floor, down a long corridor that curved just enough to obscure the view from the elevators. When I got to the door and swiped my ID badge, the lights flickered once, but the scanners came on as normal. I shrugged it off as a quirk of the building's electrical system. The first hour passed uneventfully. I processed scans from earlier in the day, cross-checking reports and cleaning the equipment for the next shift. The air conditioning hummed steadily. I could hear the faint murmur of distant voices from the nurse's station 2 floors down. Suddenly, the lights dimmed. Just for a second, but enough to catch my attention. The overhead bulbs flickered again, this time more violently. I looked up, expecting the building's maintenance crew to have notified us about some electrical work, but there had been no email, no calls. I kept working, but the atmosphere in the room shifted. The sterile, clinical brightness dimmed into an uncomfortable twilight. Shadows pooled in the corners of the room where just minutes ago there had been none. The scanners themselves emitted a faint glow, their screens displaying idle mode. Then I heard it. A faint tapping, like fingernails drumming softly on metal. I froze, scanning the room. The sound seemed to come from the wall behind me. I stood and slowly walked over, but there was nothing there, just cabinets filled with lead aprons and medical supplies. I tapped on the metal panel myself. The sound was hollow, nothing unusual. Trying to shake off the creeping unease, I returned to my station. The tapping continued, but now it was coming from somewhere else, near the ventilation ducts above the ceiling tiles. I looked up, eyes narrowing. Then a whisper. Soft. Indistinct. I couldn't make out any words, but it felt deliberate, like someone was trying to communicate but not quite getting the words out. I grabbed my phone to call the security desk. No signal. My screen showed no service. The hospital's Wi-Fi was spotty in this part of the building, but this was worse than usual. I tried the landline. Dead. That's when I noticed the monitors flickering on and off, those that showed the CT and MRI rooms down the hall. Suddenly, the scanner I had been using powered on by itself. The screen lit up, displaying a patient scan that I hadn't accessed all day. The image was grainy, almost static-like. It showed a shadowy, blurred figure in the corner of the frame. My heart skipped. I reached out to turn the scanner off, but my hand froze. The image on the screen changed. Now it was a close-up of a face I did not recognize. Pale, sunken eyes, dark circles that seemed to extend beyond the eyes, and a faint, unnatural smile stretched across cracked lips. I jerked away, knocking the scanner's power button. The screen went dark again. I sat down heavily, breathing hard. The whispering had stopped. But now there was something else. Footsteps. Soft, deliberate, coming from the hallway. I had locked the imaging room door behind me when I entered. I was alone. The footsteps paused just outside. I pressed my ear to the door. Silence. Then a knock. 1, 2, 3. Sharp, slow, insistent. I wanted to call out, but my throat tightened. Instead, I grabbed a heavy metal clipboard from my desk and edged to the door. I unlocked it and swung the door open quickly. The hallway was empty. The lights in the corridor flickered as well. I stepped out and looked left and right. No one. Just the sterile hospital corridor stretching into darkness beyond the flickering emergency lights. A faint smell hit me then. Something burnt, like ozone or static electricity mixed with something decaying. I looked down at the floor and saw a trail of wet footprints leading away from the door and toward the end of the hall. The prints were muddy, but irregular. Not like someone had just walked normally. They staggered, like someone dragging a heavy foot or someone who had trouble walking. My breath caught. I hesitated, then followed. Each step echoed, but I heard something else now. Something breathing. Heavy, labored, right behind me. I spun around. Nothing. Just the dim light and shadows. The prints stopped at the double doors to the CT scan room. The doors were cracked open, just a sliver. I pushed them fully open. Inside, the giant machine sat silently. The room was cold. Too cold. There was a chair in the corner, tipped over. I stepped in and shone my phone's flashlight. No one. But then I saw it. On the floor, smeared in what looked like dried blood, was a note. Written in shaky, almost illegible handwriting. Don't trust the shadows. I swallowed hard and backed out. That's when the lights went out entirely. Blackness enveloped me. I fumbled for my phone, but the screen was dead. No flashlight. No calls. No signal. Just the sound of my own breathing. And that heavy breathing again. Closer. I ran. I didn't care about the machines or the work. I sprinted down the corridor, blindly feeling for the door handle. I burst through and slammed the imaging department door behind me. I locked it, and then I heard it. The scraping sound of nails or claws dragging down the metal door. It lasted for several seconds. Then silence. I didn't move for a long time. Eventually, the lights flickered back on. My phone lit up with notifications. I checked the security cameras on my phone. Finally connected. But the cameras showed nothing unusual. No movement in the hallways, no strange figures, no footprints, no note. I reported everything to security the next morning. They said the power glitches were caused by recent storms. The footprints were probably mud tracked in by a cleaning crew. The note? Maybe a prank. But I know what I saw and heard, and I know that breath, close behind me. I never worked alone after that, not in that hospital, and I always made sure the doors were locked behind me, is because sometimes when you're alone, the shadows don't just hide, they watch. Story the end. I worked overnight shifts for about 6 months at a small convenience store in a suburb outside Detroit. The kind of place that never closed and where the night shift was a mix of quiet stretches and the occasional random customer stopping by. The store itself was old, built decades ago, with flickering fluorescent lights that buzzed more than they illuminated. The aisles were narrow, the shelves sometimes dusty, and the security cameras, well, they felt like they hadn't been updated since the 80s. But it paid the bills, and it gave me a chance to be alone with my thoughts while earning some steady cash. At first, working alone at night didn't bother me. I had headphones and a playlist for the slow parts, and when the clock ticked past 2 a.m., it felt like I was the only person awake in the world. The parking lot was empty, and the streetlights outside cast long shadows across the cracked pavement. I got used to the silence, even found comfort in it, until things started to shift. One night, around the third week of October, I was stocking shelves in the back aisle when I heard the faint jingle of the front door. That sound was so familiar it hardly registered, but this time there was no customer. The door to the store was propped open by a little rubber wedge to let in fresh air. A cold breeze blew in and stirred the loose papers on the counter. I glanced toward the front and saw no one. No one walking in, no one outside. I even peeked through the glass doors. Empty parking lot, no cars, no people. I shrugged it off and went back to stocking, but the feeling of being watched crept up my spine. It was the kind of chill that isn't cold but makes your skin crawl. I told myself it was nothing, probably just my imagination or the old store settling. But then I started noticing little things that didn't add up. The first was the knocking. It started 2 nights later. Around 1:15 a.m., while I was ringing up a lone customer buying cigarettes, I heard it. A steady, slow knocking sound coming from the back storage room door. The room was locked, and I was the only one with the key. I told the customer I'd be right back and carefully approached the door. The knocking stopped the moment I reached it. I opened it quickly. Empty, boxes stacked neatly inside. I closed the door and returned to the register, feeling my heartbeat thudding in my ears. The customer gave me a strange look, but said nothing. They paid and left. That night, I double-checked all the locks and windows. Everything was secure. I figured maybe a branch was hitting the door or some weird sound bouncing around the building, but the knocking came back every night after that, always between 1 a.m. and 2 a.m., always on the back door. Then the whispering started. I first heard it one night just as I was about to clock out early, about 4:30 a.m. The lights in the store were dimmed except for the registers and the front door area. The store was silent except for the hum of the fridge units and the slow beep of the cash register. I was stacking the last few candy bars on the counter when I heard it. A faint whisper, like someone murmuring just outside the door. I froze. The whisper didn't form words I could understand. It was more like breathy syllables, soft enough that I thought maybe it was coming from the ventilation or the street outside. I stepped to the door and looked out again. Nothing but empty darkness and flickering street lamps. The feeling of dread that came over me was overwhelming. I stood there for a moment, heart racing, then forced myself back to work. I checked the security cameras from the counter monitors. The lot was empty. The next few nights, the whispering grew louder. It wasn't always outside the door. Sometimes it was faint and seemed to come from the aisles themselves, like someone was standing just behind a shelf, watching me. One night, I called my manager and told her I wanted to switch shifts, but she insisted the overnight shift was fine and that I was probably just stressed. I tried to believe her. One particular night around 3 a.m., I was alone in the store, counting inventory. The knocking started again, louder this time, but not from the back door. It sounded like it was coming from the ceiling. I looked up at the ceiling tiles, some stained from years of leaks, and saw that one was slightly askew. I climbed on a ladder to check it. The tile was solid, nothing unusual. I settled back down, thinking it was rats or something. But then, right after I climbed down, the whispering started again, clearer than ever, and this time I could make out a word. It said, "Help." My breath caught. I spun around to the front door, half expecting to see someone, but the lot was empty. I tried to convince myself it was my imagination, exhaustion playing tricks on me, but deep down I was terrified. Over the next few nights, the disturbances escalated. Shelves would be knocked over after I left. The security cameras would glitch, showing static or flickering images that made no sense. The temperature inside the store would suddenly drop and my breath would fog up in the cold air. One night, I saw something in the reflection of the cooler glass. A pale figure standing just behind me, tall, thin, with dark, hollow eyes that seemed to stare straight through me. I spun around. Nothing. But when I looked back at the glass, the figure was gone. I started wearing a small pepper spray canister in my pocket and kept my phone close, texting friends during the quietest moments. I tried to document everything, but I was alone, and no one believed me. The last straw came on Halloween night. Around 3 a.m., I was doing my usual rounds, making sure the aisles were tidy. The knocking started again, this time from the ceiling and the back door simultaneously. Suddenly, the power flickered and went out. I was plunged into darkness, except for the eerie glow of emergency exit signs. I fumbled for my phone and flashlight and moved toward the front door, but it was locked tight. I tried the back door. It was jammed. Then the whispering started, all around me, louder, more frantic. The word help repeated over and over, echoing in the small store. I ran to the break room to call for help, but found the phone line dead. Panic took over. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911 on cellular. The call connected, but all I could hear was static. Then, a voice. Not a dispatcher, but a low, growling whisper. "Stay." I dropped the phone and ran to the front window, banging on the glass and screaming for help. Minutes later, the power returned, and the knocking and whispering stopped. I called the manager and quit immediately. I never went back. Weeks later, I heard from a coworker that the store had been closed for renovations. I decided to go by and check it out. As I stood in the parking lot, I noticed the back door had a fresh padlock. Peeking inside through the cracked glass, the place looked cleaner, brighter, normal. But when I looked up, I saw the ceiling tile I'd checked that night. It was hanging slightly, like it hadn't been touched in years. I never found out what was behind that tile. I don't want to. Sometimes I still hear whispers when I'm alone at night. I don't know what it was, or why it chose that store, or me, but I'm glad I left before it got worse. Story, the end. The office was supposed to be empty. The building's security protocol made sure of that. After 7 p.m., all employees were expected to be gone and the doors locked down. But I had volunteered to stay late that Thursday night to finish a critical report that was due the next morning. The project was a mess, and the pressure to get it right was immense. So around 6 p.m., I settled into my cubicle, switched on the overhead fluorescent lights, and prepared for a long, quiet night. The usual hum of the air conditioning filled the space, along with the faint buzz of the fluorescent tubes overhead. The building felt eerily quiet, almost dead, except for the tapping of my fingers on the keyboard and the occasional creak of the floorboards beneath my feet. I tried to focus on the report, but the silence was heavy and my thoughts kept wandering. Around 7:45 p.m., the lights flickered once, briefly, and then steadied. I glanced up, annoyed. This old building had a habit of acting up when it was cold outside. I pulled my sweater tighter around me and took a sip of my lukewarm coffee. Suddenly, a distant thud echoed from somewhere deeper in the building, maybe the storage room or the janitor's closet. It was faint, but unmistakable. I told myself it was probably the building settling or maybe a rat knocking something over. Still, I paused, listening. Nothing followed. I went back to my report, trying to ignore the chill creeping up my spine. At 9:15 p.m., I stood up to stretch and decided to walk over to the kitchenette for another coffee. The hallway was dimly lit by a row of flickering bulbs, casting long, distorted shadows on the walls. As I walked, the silence was pierced by the faint sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, and echoing against the empty corridor. I froze. The building should be empty. I turned, scanning the hallway behind me. No one was there. I quickened my pace, telling myself it was just my imagination. Maybe the sound of my own footsteps was playing tricks on me. In the kitchenette, I flicked on the light. It buzzed a little, but stayed steady. I filled my cup, but as I turned, I heard it again. The footsteps coming from the hallway outside. They were slow, measured, definitely not my own. I stepped out, peering down the corridor. Empty. A cold draft swept past me. The temperature seemed to drop suddenly. Goosebumps rose on my arms. I told myself it was just the air conditioning kicking in. Back at my desk by 9:30, I powered up my laptop and tried to ignore the creeping feeling that I was being watched. Around 10 p.m., the building's emergency lights flickered on briefly and the main power cut out for a moment. My screen went dark, the hum of the computers stilled. I reached for my phone, but there was no signal, no Wi-Fi, no cellular. Panic hit me. I was alone, stuck in a building that suddenly felt hostile. Then the lights snapped back on. I exhaled slowly, relief washing over me. But then I noticed my email inbox had a new message. The sender was unknown. The subject line was blank. The body contained only one sentence: I see you. My hands trembled as I deleted the message. I checked the security cameras on the monitor. All showed empty halls. I told myself it was some sick prank. At 11:15 p.m., the tapping started. This time, it was right outside my office door. Slow, rhythmic, like someone tapping their fingers against the glass. I looked up, but the hallway was empty. I reached for the door handle, and suddenly the door slid open by itself. I jumped back, heart racing. There was no one there. I slammed the door shut and locked it. My breath came fast and shallow. The tapping continued, now on the walls, the ceiling, the floor. I covered my ears, desperate to block out the sound. Suddenly, the computer screens around me flickered and displayed static. Then, for a brief moment, a face appeared on my monitor, pale, gaunt, eyes hollow, and staring directly at me. I blinked. It was gone. I tried to call for help on my phone, still no signal. I felt trapped. Hours passed in that terrible state of half sleep and terror. At 3 a.m., the janitor arrived for his shift. I rushed to the main door and banged on it. He looked at me with confusion. "You shouldn't be here alone this late," he said. When I explained everything, he just nodded slowly. "Sometimes this place gets restless. You should have never stayed alone." The next day, I asked around about the building's history. I learned it was built over an old graveyard, later converted into a mental hospital, then abandoned before finally becoming offices. Employees spoke in hushed tones about strange noises, shadows, and unexplained power outages. I never stayed late alone after that. Sometimes when the office is quiet, I swear I still hear that tapping. Story. The end. The office building was an old brick structure that had once been a bank headquarters before the company moved in about 5 years ago. On the surface, it was charming, a bit dated, but with character. The main lobby was lined with marble floors and high ceilings, while the upper floors had narrow hallways, fluorescent lighting, and rows of cubicles separated by low partitions. The IT department was on the fourth floor, and that's where I worked as a systems administrator. Most days were uneventful, routine server checks, updating software, troubleshooting network issues, but late nights alone in the office always felt a little different. The hum of the servers and the occasional buzz of fluorescent lights became a soundtrack for isolation. It was a Wednesday evening in early November. I had volunteered to stay late to finish migrating some databases before the scheduled upgrade over the weekend. The rest of the office cleared out by 6 p.m., leaving me with the quiet that comes from being the only person left. I had the place to myself except for the night janitor, who would come through once or twice to do rounds. By 7:30 p.m., I had finished my immediate work and decided to take a short break before the next batch of processes kicked in. I grabbed a cup of coffee from the small break room and headed back to my desk. The lights in the hallways outside the IT suite flickered intermittently, a common issue with the aging wiring. I found it annoying, but ignored it. At around 8:15, I heard a faint knocking noise. It was coming from somewhere down the hall, possibly near the conference rooms. I glanced up from my screen, but saw nothing. The building was supposed to be locked down after 7 p.m., and no one was supposed to be wandering around. The janitor had already come by about 30 minutes ago, so it wasn't him. The knocking stopped as suddenly as it started. Thinking maybe it was the building settling or some loose pipe, I shrugged it off and continued working. At 9 p.m., I decided to check the server room to make sure everything was running smoothly. It was a small, windowless room at the end of the hall with racks of blinking equipment. The door had a keypad lock that I had the code for. When I approached, the hallway lights dimmed for a second and then flickered back on. It was a weird glitch, but nothing new. I entered the code, the door beeped, and I stepped inside. The server room was cold and smelled faintly of ozone and plastic. I checked the logs on the mainframe, scanned the cooling system, and everything seemed normal. Then I heard it. A soft scraping noise, like something being dragged lightly across the floor behind me. I froze. There was no one else who should have been in the building, and the janitor had already left hours ago. I turned slowly, expecting to see maybe a mouse or a rat. Nothing. I listened carefully, but the sound was gone. I told myself it was the air conditioner kicking in or cables shifting. I left the server room, locking the door behind me. Back at my desk, I double-checked the building security feed from the small monitor on my computer. The camera covering the hallway outside my office showed only shadows and empty corridors. No one moved. At 10:30, I started packing my things. Just as I was about to shut down my computer, the lights in the entire fourth floor flickered and went out, plunging the room into darkness. The hum of the servers stopped abruptly. My heart jumped. I grabbed my phone and used the flashlight to find the emergency exit door. The building had backup generators, but apparently they had failed. I called the building management number listed on my phone. No answer. I tried the janitor's extension. No answer. The silence was heavy. I headed toward the stairwell to leave the building. As I reached the door, I heard footsteps behind me. Slow, deliberate, and getting closer. I froze. "Hello?" I called out, voice trembling. No response. I turned quickly, shining my phone light into the darkness of the hallway. Nothing. The footsteps stopped. I exhaled and hurried down the stairs. At the lobby, the emergency exit door was locked electronically. I tried the handle, no luck. The building's main entrance was several blocks away and locked tight. I was trapped. Panic set in. I went back to the stairwell, trying to find another exit. At the second floor landing, the lights flickered on briefly, revealing a figure standing at the far end of the hallway. A woman, pale, with long, dark hair obscuring her face. She was motionless. I blinked. She vanished. I ran the rest of the way to the lobby and tried the main entrance again. Still locked. I pulled out my phone again. No signal, no Wi-Fi. I sat down on a bench, heart pounding. Minutes passed like hours. I kept glancing back at the stairwell. Then I heard whispering. Soft voices, unintelligible, coming from the vents above. The temperature dropped sharply. My breath fogged in the air. Suddenly, the lights flickered back on. The servers powered up with a low hum. The building was alive again. I hurried outside, feeling like I just escaped something. Later, I asked the building manager about the outage. He said the emergency generator had been tested the week before and was fine. No one else reported problems, and there was no record of anyone else being in the building after hours. But I knew I wasn't alone, because the woman I saw was not human. Story the end. I worked the night shift at a small family-owned convenience store on the edge of town. It wasn't a glamorous job, but it paid the bills while I was finishing college. The store stayed open 24 hours, but after midnight, the foot traffic slowed to almost nothing. Most nights, I was alone from about 11 p.m. until the morning shift came in around 7 a.m. The building was old, a single-story brick structure with flickering fluorescent lights and a handful of security cameras mounted in the corners. The back door led to a small alley, usually empty except for the stray cats and the occasional delivery truck. The owner, an older man named Frank, was usually pretty chill, just asking me to keep an eye on the place and call him if anything seemed off. I'd been working there for almost 6 months when things started feeling different. It began on a slow Tuesday night in late October. The store was quiet, and I was restocking some shelves in the candy aisle when I heard a soft tapping sound coming from the front door. I looked up. No one was there. The automatic doors weren't broken, so they shouldn't be making noise on their own. I shrugged it off as the wind and went back to stacking. A few minutes later, the tapping started again, this time a little louder and more rhythmic. Tap, tap, tap. I glanced at the door again. The neon open sign was flickering slightly, casting an eerie red glow across the tiled floor. Still, no one outside. Hello? I called out, expecting a homeless person or a late-night customer, but no reply came. The tapping stopped abruptly. I told myself it was nothing. About an hour later, I was in the back room counting inventory when the store's loudspeaker crackled on. It was that old intercom system Frank had installed years ago, barely functional. Hello? Hello? Came a faint, garbled voice. I froze. I didn't answer. The voice repeated once more, barely audible. Hello? Help? Then silence. I rushed back to the store floor and checked the cameras on the monitor behind the register. The feeds were all normal. Empty aisles, no one by the front entrance, no suspicious movement anywhere. Still, my skin was crawling. I called Frank and told him what happened. He laughed it off. Must have been some interference, probably a truck radio or something. Don't worry about it. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Over the next week, the strange noises increased. I started hearing footsteps in the aisles when no one was there. Sometimes it sounded like someone was walking slowly, pacing back and forth. Other times, it was the unmistakable sound of fingernails scratching against the glass of the refrigerated cases. One night, I was on my break in the break room when I heard a knock on the back door. It was a soft, deliberate knock, 3 slow taps. I got up, heart pounding, and peeked through the small window. No one. I checked the alley with the flashlight. Empty. When I went back inside, the lights flickered and the temperature dropped suddenly. My breath was visible in the cold air. The store's doorbell chimed, an old-fashioned bell that rang whenever someone entered or left the store. I turned around. The front door was closed. No one had come in. By this point, I was seriously creeped out. I started keeping the register drawer locked and the back door chained from the inside. I even asked Frank to install a motion sensor light outside, hoping it would scare off anyone lurking around. One night, I was closing up early after a slow shift. The clock read 11:58 p.m. I was wiping down the counter when I noticed the security camera monitor flicker. Static, then a blurry figure appeared on screen. It was standing in the middle aisle. I zoomed in. The figure looked like a woman wearing a long dress, her hair hanging in front of her face. She wasn't moving. I blinked, and the figure vanished. My hands trembled as I grabbed the phone to call Frank. Before I could dial, the lights went out. Complete darkness. The emergency backup lights kicked on, dim red bulbs illuminating just enough to see. I could hear something breathing, heavy, ragged, close. I spun around. No one there. I tried the light switches. Nothing. Then the intercom crackled again. Help. This time, it was clear, right next to my ear. I dropped the phone and bolted for the exit, fumbling with the lock. I don't know how long I stood there, shaking, before I finally got the door open and ran outside into the cold night air. I called Frank from my car. He promised to come down immediately. When he arrived, he looked around with me, checking the breaker box, the lights, the security system. Everything was fine. Must have been a short, he said, shrugging. But I knew better. The next day, I quit. I never told anyone why. Sometimes, when I'm driving past that store late at night, I swear I see the lights flicker and hear faint whispers. I still get chills thinking about that night. The breathing close behind me, the ghostly figure in the aisle, and the desperate voice begging for help. I don't work nights anymore. Story the end. The night I worked alone at the old printing plant was like any other at first. Just the hum of the machines and the faint buzz of the fluorescent lights overhead. I had started the graveyard shift a few weeks earlier, filling in for a coworker who'd taken a leave, and honestly, the place gave me the creeps. It was an aging building on the edge of town, a relic from a time when the printing business was booming. Most of the equipment had been shut down, but a few presses still ran overnight to fill small orders. The rest of the factory was mostly empty, vast and echoing with the sound of the machines. I was the only person there from midnight until 7 a.m., and for the first couple of weeks, the loneliness was just part of the job. I'd walk through the cavernous hallways, checking on the machines, stacking boxes, and occasionally using the security monitors to make sure no one was sneaking in. The building was locked tight, and I was told by management that nothing unusual had happened in years. Still, there was a strange feeling hanging in the air, like the building itself was holding its breath. On the third night, something changed. Around 2:30 a.m., I was in the main production room taking inventory when I heard it, a faint tapping sound coming from the far end of the factory floor. At first, I thought it was a loose pipe or the machinery settling, but it was rhythmic and deliberate, like someone knocking. I froze and listened closely. The tapping continued, soft, slow, deliberate, then stopped suddenly. I scanned the room, but no one was there. The only noise was the mechanical hum of the presses. Trying to shake it off, I moved on with my work, but the uneasy feeling didn't leave me. About an hour later, I was near the loading docks when I saw movement on one of the security monitors, a shadow flickering just outside the gate. I grabbed my flashlight and went to check, but when I got there, the lot was empty except for the occasional rustling of wind through the trash bins. On the monitor, the shadow had vanished. I told myself it was just my imagination, or maybe a stray animal. That night, I had trouble sleeping when I got home. Over the next few nights, the incidents escalated. The tapping returned each night, always between 2 and 3 a.m., and it always came from somewhere deep inside the factory. The shadow on the monitors appeared again, sometimes just a flicker, sometimes a more defined figure standing near the loading dock. One night, while walking down a narrow hallway lined with stacks of old newspapers, I caught a glimpse of a figure out of the corner of my eye. I spun around, flashlight raised, but no one was there. I started locking the doors behind me and double-checking windows, but the feeling of being watched never left. Then came the whispering. It started faintly at first, like the hum of the machines or the wind outside, but I could swear it was voices. I couldn't make out words, but the tone was urgent, desperate. One night I stopped in my tracks when I distinctly heard the words, "Help me." I searched the building, but it was empty except for me. I called the manager to report the sounds, but he dismissed it as the building settling. The worst night was about a week later. I was alone, walking past the main press area when the tapping started, loud and frantic. I followed the sound to a small door that led to a disused storage room I hadn't noticed before. The door was slightly ajar. Inside, the air was cold and musty. As I shone my flashlight inside, the beam caught something on the floor. A faded photograph of a man in old work clothes, stained and worn. It looked like it was from the 1950s. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind me. I yanked it open and bolted out, heart pounding. I ran back to the control room and locked myself in. The monitors flickered, and on the screen I saw the figure again, this time clearer. A ghostly man standing just outside the building, staring in. I quit the job the next day. Months later, I learned the factory had been the site of a tragic accident decades ago, a fire that killed a worker trapped inside. They never found his body. Sometimes when I drive past the building at night, I see a shadow in the window, just standing there, watching. I don't go near anymore. Story the end. The office was a nondescript building tucked into a business park that had a history I hadn't known much about when I started working there. It was just a 2-story beige brick box with tinted windows, shared by a few small companies. I worked for a tech startup on the second floor, in a small team that had just been downsized, so the office was quieter than usual. Most days, I was the only one left by early evening, especially on weekdays when others would leave around 5 or 6. It was early February, a week before Valentine's Day, and I had volunteered to work late one night to finish a crucial project deployment. The plan was simple: get in around 3 p.m., work through the evening, and leave by midnight once the rollout was complete. The first few hours went smoothly. I was wrapped in the hum of the computers, the steady clacking of my keyboard the only real sound. The rest of the building was silent. I was alone. Around 8:30 p.m., I took a break to get coffee from the kitchenette. It was a small space with a single flickering fluorescent bulb overhead, an old coffee maker, and a tiny fridge that always smelled faintly of expired yogurt. As I waited for the coffee to brew, I heard something strange, soft, rhythmic tapping coming from the hallway outside the kitchenette. The sound wasn't regular like a clock ticking. It was uneven, almost like footsteps or someone lightly tapping their fingers against the wall. I froze and strained to listen. Then it stopped. I glanced out into the hallway. It was completely empty, the dull carpet and white walls stretching down in both directions. The security cameras that overlooked the hall were covered with small stickers. They had been for months. I didn't think much of it at first. The company had a reputation for lax security. Back at my desk, the tapping noise returned, but this time it seemed closer, right outside my office door. My office was a tiny glass-walled cubicle, separated from the hallway by a clear glass partition and a sliding door. The tapping now sounded like it was coming from the glass itself. I got up and slowly approached the door, heart rate climbing. I looked through the glass. The hallway was still empty. I touched the glass where the tapping had been loudest. Cold, smooth, nothing unusual. When I turned back inside, I caught movement in the corner of my eye, a shadow flitting behind the row of cubicles. I blinked. Nothing there. I told myself it was my imagination, but the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I sat back down, trying to focus on work, but the uneasy feeling lingered. Around 10 p.m., I heard the office phone ring. It was odd because all calls were supposed to be forwarded to our cell phones after hours, and mine hadn't rung once. I picked up, expecting a client or coworker. There was only silence, then a whisper, barely audible, but unmistakably human. I strained to hear. The voice said, "Help me." I froze, the handset pressed against my ear. "Who is this?" I whispered. No answer. I hung up, hands shaking. I tried to shrug it off as a prank call, but then the lights flickered, the air grew cold, and the humming of the computers distorted into an eerie drone. Suddenly, the door to my cubicle slid open by itself with a soft creak. I jumped up, heart pounding. The hallway was empty. I closed the door quickly and locked it. My phone buzzed. A text message from an unknown number. "I'm here." I stared at the screen, breath shallow. I wanted to leave, but the elevator was out of order. The stairwell door on the second floor required a key card, which I didn't have. I was trapped. I tried the emergency exit door, but it was chained shut from the inside, a violation of fire code I should have reported months ago, but never did. I sat down on the floor, trying to calm down. The tapping started again, louder now. It was coming from the wall behind me. I turned, and the glass wall that separated my cubicle from the hallway fogged up from the inside. A message appeared, smudged with finger streaks. Don't leave me. The computer screens flickered and then shut off. Darkness enveloped the office. I heard footsteps, slow, deliberate, approaching. I held my breath. Then the power returned. The text message was gone. The glass was clear again. I packed up as fast as I could and ran for the stairwell, managing to buzz the security desk to open the door. I didn't look back until I was outside in the cold night air. The building looked normal, silent, unassuming. The next day, I reported the strange events, but the security cameras showed no one in the halls, no one using the elevators, no disturbances. I never found out who called or sent the messages. Weeks later, when the office was closed for a weekend, maintenance workers discovered the body of a homeless man who had died inside the building's abandoned basement. No one knew how he got there. I sometimes wonder if that whisper for help was his, if he ever wanted someone to hear him. I never worked late alone again. Story the end. The building where I worked was an old office tower downtown, a relic of the 1980s with faded carpet and flickering fluorescent lights that buzzed softly in the dead silence of night. I was a security guard assigned to the third shift from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., patrolling the empty halls, checking doors and windows, and monitoring the security cameras from a small room on the 12th floor. The job was monotonous but steady, perfect for someone who wanted quiet hours to think or study. Most nights, I'd spend hours just walking the corridors, making sure nothing was out of place, occasionally radioing in a check. The building was usually empty except for me and the cleaning crew who worked from 2 to 4 a.m., so being alone wasn't unusual. But there was one night that changed everything. It started just after midnight. I was sitting in the security room, sipping coffee and watching the bank of monitors. The feeds showed empty hallways, deserted offices, and dark stairwells. Suddenly, one of the cameras in the east wing flickered. The image distorted briefly, then came back with static lines rolling across it. I reached to adjust the monitor, but the static persisted. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I thought I saw movement, a shadow flickering just beyond the camera's range. I zoomed in on the feed, but the hallway was empty. I double-checked the camera placement and confirmed that no one was supposed to be there. The east wing had been closed for renovations for over a month. I chalked it up to a glitch and tried to focus on my rounds. About 20 minutes later, I walked down the east wing corridor. The smell hit me first, a faint, sour odor like stale sweat mixed with something else, something metallic. The hallway was dimly lit by emergency lights, casting long shadows that danced on the cracked walls. I walked cautiously, keycard in hand, unlocking the door to the stairwell to check for any signs of trespassers. The stairwell was empty, but I noticed muddy footprints on the steps, fresh, smeared, and leading downwards. That was impossible. The east wing was under construction, and the stairwell was supposed to be locked from both ends. I called the front desk to confirm the building was secure. The voice on the other end assured me the cleaning crew was only in the lobby area and that the construction team was off-site for the night. I returned to the security room, my stomach knotting. Hours passed uneventfully until just before 3 a.m., Then the building's intercom system crackled to life, emitting a soft, distorted voice. "Help me," it whispered. I froze, eyes wide. The voice was faint but desperate, repeating the plea over and over. "Hello, is anyone there?" I called into the intercom. No response. The voice faded away like a gust of wind, leaving only silence. I checked the camera feeds again. The East Wing camera was still glitching, the screen flickering erratically. I grabbed my flashlight and headed back toward the East Wing. This time, the doors were locked tight. The muddy footprints had disappeared. I radioed the police for backup, but told them I didn't have any intruder, just wanted a second pair of eyes. When the officer arrived, we did a thorough sweep. Nothing. No footprints, no signs of forced entry, no strange smells. The next night, I wasn't scheduled. When I came back, the East Wing had been sealed off with bright orange tape and a new security system installed. The glitching camera had been replaced. Still, the smell lingered faintly near the doors, and sometimes when I walked the corridors alone, I heard faint whispers over the radio, static voices calling out, "Help me." I never found out who or what it was, but I quit soon after. Story the end. The night shift at the logistics warehouse was supposed to be quiet. Just me, the hum of the fluorescent lights, and the constant beeping of forklifts moving pallets from one end of the building to the other. I had worked there for a little over a year, mostly the afternoon shifts, but due to some scheduling changes, I got stuck with the overnight shift for a week. The only other person on site during those hours was the security guard, who spent his time wandering the perimeter or watching the surveillance feeds. But his shift didn't start until 11 p.m., so for that first hour, I was completely alone. The warehouse was massive, a cavernous space full of towering metal shelves stacked with boxes. The aisles stretched out for what felt like miles, and the only way to navigate was by following the overhead fluorescent lights. The air smelled faintly of cardboard and diesel fuel, a strange but oddly comforting scent by now. There was a cafeteria in the back corner, but it was locked after hours, so my only refuge was the small office where I sat in front of the computer, scanning barcodes and managing inventory. That first night alone, I tried to keep busy. I walked the aisles on foot, checking for any misplaced packages or damaged goods, listening for the distant clatter of boxes or the drone of forklifts. Everything was as expected, silent except for the hum of the ventilation system and my footsteps echoing off the concrete floor. Around 10:30 p.m., the power flickered once. The lights dimmed for just a second, enough to make me pause and look up, but everything stayed on. I told myself it was just a minor surge, nothing unusual for an old building like this. But after that, a faint smell drifted through the aisles, something metallic, like blood and rust. I couldn't place it, and it wasn't strong enough to be alarming, but it made my skin crawl. I shrugged it off, blaming the smell on a rusty pipe or an old machine leaking oil somewhere nearby. Around 11 p.m., the security guard showed up. He was an older guy named Tom, a bit gruff, but generally friendly enough. He checked in, handed me a walkie-talkie for emergencies, and told me to call if anything seemed off. I nodded, feeling a bit relieved to have some company. But even with Tom there, the warehouse never felt quite right. About an hour later, while doing my rounds near the far end of the building, the part that rarely saw activity, I noticed something odd. The overhead lights there were flickering, the way old fluorescent bulbs do when they're about to die. I stopped under one of the flickering lights, and a sudden chill ran through me. The air felt thick, almost suffocating. I moved on, but the feeling followed me. As I passed aisle 47, I caught a glimpse of movement out of the corner of my eye. Something quick and shadowy darting between the boxes. I spun around, flashlight sweeping the shelves, but nothing was there. No one was supposed to be in that part of the warehouse except me and Tom was on the other side of the building. I tried to shake off the unease, telling myself it was a rat or some other small animal. I have always been a skeptic, especially about creepy stuff. But then the noises started, soft tapping, like fingers drumming on metal, echoing faintly from the shelves. At first, I thought it was the building settling or maybe some loose packaging falling, but the tapping had a rhythm. 3 taps, then a pause, then 4 taps. It sounded almost deliberate. I called Tom on the walkie-talkie. No answer. I walked toward the back office, hoping to find him there or catch him on the radio. The tapping grew louder, echoing through the aisles like a heartbeat. I found Tom's radio on the floor near a stack of pallets, dead batteries scattered around it. He wasn't there. I started searching for him, calling out his name. The warehouse was suddenly oppressive, the silence broken only by that tapping noise. I walked toward the loading docks and found one of the large bay doors cracked open. It shouldn't have been. They were supposed to be locked tight after hours. The night air was cold and smelled of rain. The door was heavy and scraped against the concrete floor. I called Tom again. Still nothing. I went back inside, locked the door behind me, and checked the security monitors. The cameras showed empty aisles, but the flickering light in aisle 47 was clearly visible on the feed. Suddenly, the monitor froze on a frame showing a shadowy figure standing near the back of the warehouse. The figure was blurry and out of focus, but unmistakably human-shaped. I leaned in closer and the screen flickered, then went black. The building lost power again, plunging me into darkness. My flashlight's batteries started to die. Panic crept in. I grabbed my phone to use as a light and called 911. The call connected but was garbled, static-filled, and then disconnected abruptly. When the emergency dispatcher tried to call me back, the line was dead. I heard footsteps, slow, heavy, somewhere behind me. I whipped around with my phone's light, but no one was there. I ran to the main office, locked the door, and barricaded myself inside. Minutes later, the lights flickered back on. The monitors were all dead, screens blank. The only sound was the steady tapping, now coming from inside the office walls. I held my breath, heart pounding. Then the tapping stopped. No footsteps. No noises. Nothing. At dawn, the day shift arrived to find me pale and shaken, sitting on the floor in the dark office, clutching the walkie-talkie. I told them what happened. The security guard was missing. An immediate search was launched. Tom was never found. They chalked it up to an accident. Maybe he fell or got trapped somewhere in the vast warehouse. But something about that night haunted me. I quit the job the next day. The tapping still echoes in my head, and sometimes when I'm alone in a quiet room, I swear I can feel someone watching. Story the end. Working alone in a small-town library on the night shift was never something I thought would turn into one of the most unnerving weeks of my life. The library was old, built in the early 1900s, with thick wooden shelves, stained glass windows, and creaky floorboards that seemed to protest at every step you took. I worked as a part-time librarian, mostly during the day, but the night shifts came around once every few months, mostly during quieter weeks. Usually, it was peaceful, just me, the smell of old books, and the soft glow of desk lamps. One late autumn week, I was assigned to cover the entire library overnight. The regular night librarian was on vacation, and the manager trusted me to hold down the fort. I didn't mind. I liked the quiet, the solitude. It was a chance to catch up on reading, organizing, and just enjoy the space without the usual daytime crowds. The first night was uneventful. I arrived around 6 p.m., locked the front doors behind me, and began my usual rounds. The heater rumbled softly, and the building smelled faintly of dust and aged paper. I set up my little station at the main desk, plugged in my laptop, and started cataloging some donations. As midnight approached, the library became even quieter. The world outside seemed to slip away, and I felt cocooned in a comforting bubble of silence and stillness. Occasionally, I would hear the creaks and groans of the old building settling. That was nothing new. But then, on the second night, things began to feel off. Around 1 a.m., I was shelving some books in the far back corner of the library near the archives. The archives room was separated by a heavy wooden door with a small glass window. I heard a faint tapping sound coming from behind that door. It was rhythmic, 3 taps, then a pause, then 2 taps again. I paused, heart quickening, and listened carefully. The library was supposed to be empty. I called out softly, "Hello? Is someone there?" No answer. The tapping stopped. Shrugging it off, I finished shelving and headed back toward the main area. As I walked down the aisles, I noticed a chill in the air. The temperature seemed to drop suddenly, the kind of cold that sinks into your bones. My breath fogged in the dim light. I tried to convince myself it was just a draft, maybe a window left open somewhere or the old heating system acting up. But then I noticed something strange. The stained glass windows, their colors were shifting, not literally changing, but the shadows around them seemed to twist, like something was moving just beyond the glass. I blinked, and the effect was gone. Back at my desk, I turned on the desk lamp and sat down, trying to focus on my work. But I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time I glanced up, I thought I saw movement in the corners of my eyes, a flicker of shadow, a hint of something just beyond sight. At about 2 a.m., the lights flickered. The entire library dimmed for a few seconds before the power stabilized. When the lights returned, I noticed that one of the heavy oak doors near the archives was slightly ajar. I was sure I had closed it. Approaching carefully, I pushed it shut and locked it. Then I checked all the windows and doors on my way back. All were secure. I sat back down, heart pounding, and decided to call the manager to report the odd happenings. The phone line was dead. No dial tone, no static, just silence. A sudden loud thump echoed from the upper floor. The library had a small mezzanine where some rare books were kept. I hesitated, then grabbed my flashlight and headed upstairs. The floor creaked beneath me as I ascended the narrow stairs. The thump came again, louder, like something heavy dropping. I reached the mezzanine and swept the beam across the shelves. Everything looked normal, no sign of anything amiss. But then I heard a whisper. It was faint, almost unintelligible, like someone murmuring right beside me. I spun around, but there was no one. The whispering stopped. I hurried back downstairs, locking the mezzanine door behind me. The rest of the night passed with little incident. I kept the lights on, the radio playing soft classical music to drown out the silence. The next morning, when the day staff arrived, I recounted the events. They smiled nervously and told me the library had a long history. Stories of the original librarian who died mysteriously, of patrons seeing shadows or hearing strange noises at night. They said some things never left. I never stayed for another night shift after that. Sometimes when I'm alone in quiet places, I swear I hear the tapping again. Story. The end.